All right, it looks like the numbers are slowing down. So panelists, if you're ready, we're gonna get started here. So let me introduce myself. I am Nicole Forbes, the content manager for Equitana USA, and I'd like to officially welcome you all to the equestrian celebration. We were really hoping to make it to Kentucky later this month for Equitana USA live in person at the Kentucky Horse Park, but lo and behold, we are here virtually. So we can all look forward to seeing each other next year, October 1st through 3rd at the Kentucky Horse Park for Equitana USA 2021. Until then, we're going to continue with these virtual presentations, and we are very excited to present today's panel with Etalon Diagnostics. We'll be discussing the genetic secrets for horse performance and have an amazing lineup of experts with us today. So with that, we're going to start off with a video, and then we were going to jump into a Q&A session with the Etalon team and their experts shortly after. All right, enjoy.
So much of what we value modern horses for is beneath the surface. Their temperament, their competitiveness, even their strength takes years, if not decades, to build and hone into the talent that's required to succeed at these athletic disciplines. It's very hard to appreciate those types of qualities from the surface of the animal, if not impossible. What the DNA can do for us is give us more information about their genetic potential, what they have inherited from both their parents that's going to give them an edge over another horse that might have the same outward appearance.
It's largely a big genetic discovery platform specializing in horses, but the unique kind of added twist comes where we collaborate with the people who really know the horses much better than anyone, and that would be the horse owners, riders, and competitors.
My name is Erin Ballard. I am an active member of the Canadian show jumping team. Lastly, competed for Canada at the World Equestrian Games. I'm a rider, trainer, I run the barn, I'm an owner, and I'm a breeder. So I would say I have a personal interest in genetics for show jumping. I also will look for horses with specific bloodlines because they have the characteristics that I like as far as they're competitive. And I think that that's one thing that you cannot train a horse to be. They're born that way. To be competitive and to have that winning edge, that's in them. So it can be quite fascinating.
Genetically speaking, I have learned that I have a horse that has two different genes, one endurance and one called sprint. And knowing that now, I really understand why he does behave the way he does. The endurance means he does last a long time. The sprint allows him to have that wonderful run to stop. And my other horse has just two of the sprints, and he actually runs out of energy, and I have to conserve him when I'm competing.
Thanks, Etalon, for joining us here in Middleburg, Virginia, where we are examining the problems of equine genetics in lameness and suitability for breeding within the equine community. We think this can only be solved with a partnership of equine technology and horsemen.
Okay, now that we're back, I think we're going to jump into a Q&A here. Krista, did you want to quickly introduce our panelists?
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate you having us here. I think I may be speaking out of turn here, but I'm not sure they need introduction, but I'll go around the room anyway. We have Mr. Jeff Petska here with us. He is the chef de keep of the U.S. reining team. He is fantastic at explaining behavior and training methodologies within the reining discipline, and I'm certain others. We have Dr. Kent Allen of Virginia Equine Imaging. He has some pretty spectacular expertise in technology in his clinic, specifically when it comes to things like kissing spines, lameness, and any kind of imaging technology. He's on the forefront of that. We have Karen O'Connor, U.S. Olympic athlete, and I believe you are the top woman in the sport for what, 10 years in a row or something like that, some astronomical number. And then we have Dr. Samantha Brooks. She is an equine geneticist. When we got together from Cornell, now at University of Florida, she is also a wicked eventing rider. But Nicole, this is your show. What would you like to ask?
Yes, we're going to start off with a question that we received earlier today. The question is there a way to determine the percentage of certain performance traits, such as early speed or competitiveness, that a thoroughbred foal has inherited from its sire or dam? If so, is it possible to see if a specific trait was passed down to a foal from its grandsire or its dam?
I'd say that is definitely a question for the geneticist. Dr. Brooks, would you like to unmute and talk all about this?
Sure. So actually the question mentions two very important components of the performance horse. One in terms of speed, and then that idea of competitiveness. That's very behavioral. That heart that they need to want to win, that's a very different type of trait. So we do have a few available tests for some performance measures. There is a marker near the myostatin gene that does confer some proclivity to be either a sprinter or a distance horse. Now, that difference is best seen among stakes winning horses. So if you have an excellent horse, then that particular marker is going to help to tip the scales between a sprinter and a distance. And we have some other markers that are near the dopamine receptor gene, one of those. And that confers a little bit of some risk-taking behavior. So whether you have a very bold and curious horse or one who's a little more standoffish. So, you know, if you're racing in a big field, maybe you would rather have that bold, curious horse. But at the same time, you know, if in some situations, maybe you want a very quick and handy jumper that's clean and is not going to knock any rails, you might rather have that vigilant horse who's going to be a little bit more cautious as they go around the jump course, thinking of a lot of our thoroughbreds who end up doing other things after they finish their racing career. So already we have a couple components that are important to the thoroughbred mix. And I'll mention a third one because I just think it's very important, is we have an excellent marker for roaring. And that is very common in the thoroughbred horse, actually. And ironically, that very same marker confers a little bit of extra height on the thoroughbred, actually a total of 3 inches in height. And that height, we know from studies, confers a little bit extra money, statistically speaking, on the track. They'll win a little bit more and they'll bring a little bit more at the sale if they're just a little bit taller. But at the same time, that very same locus is increasing the risk for recurrent laryngeal neuropathy or roaring. And as Dr. Allen can tell us, a thoroughbred or a sport horse who's a roarer is really going to struggle to perform, even if he has the optimal profile for behavior and heart and is perfectly sound and has very strong muscles, right, Ken?
We got another question just now. Krista, I believe you might be able to help out with this one. It says, will there be a demo of the portal system as part of this session? Somebody saw the few slides in the video and got a little excited. Is that something that we can show them?
I think not only can we show them, we'll show them live with actual horses, and we'll let Jeff Petska let that cat out of the bag, or horse out of the bag, as it were.
You want me to jump in here, Krista?
Sure. Let me pull up your profile, and I'm going to share my screen if that's okay with y'all. This is a live profile. This actually belongs to Mr. Petska.
So this mare is a daughter of a mare that I owned, a mare named Always Had Done It, and she was one of those life-changing individuals for me. We bought her, client bought her as a yearling and a safer, showed her, and then started to breed her, and she was just a phenomenal producer. The mare has produced, this mare on the screen's mother has produced just well, we figured 20 some colts, and I think 15 or 16 have been money earners. And so when Krista contacted me about this mare, she said that she was unique in the fact that she carried the curious and the vigilant variant, as well as the speed and the endurance variant, which for a quarter horse is highly unusual. And she was able, without even knowing much about this mare besides her genetic makeup, she was able to tell me was to be around, which was quite fascinating to me. And so with that, we started to test more horses. I tested some other ones out of that mare, and it made me realize that as trainers or as breeders or as competitors, we can, by using this technology, we can inform ourselves a lot more about what type of individual we're dealing with. And then my hope is if we can marry this information with more trainers and more breeders, then we can start to come up with training methods and techniques that are most beneficial to, say, your curious vigilant or your curious, and how they'll respond to different training methods. And this here combination that we have on the screen now, you know, that's exciting to me as a breeder, because Spook's Got a Whiz, in my estimation, is one of the greatest reigning sires that we've had in a long time. And to match him with that mare of mine, which she's a bit of a handful, but the Spook's Got a Whizzes that I've ridden are phenomenally good-minded horses. And so to me, you know, looking at that information, it really gets me excited about the possibilities of breeding that mare to a stud like Spook's Got a Whiz. Just a little side note is I have a very good friend that is a big breeder. They've been breeding for 50, 60 years, and they run 300-400 brood mares. And when I discussed this mare with him, he told me it might take you a couple generations to get her figured out as far as her cross. And with this information, I think we can condense that time down to a lot less, and that's very exciting for me.
Shall I change up the match for you so we can discuss one of the other horses by which we compared her? So we don't have a photo for Tommy Gunn. This is one of the other horses you wanted to discuss. And if we add him as a stallion, go ahead.
This is one Tommy Gunn's a horse he's out of the same mare as Always a Shiny Chick, by a son of Gunner. And he possesses the phenomenal mind and the trainability of his mother, yet he may lack a little bit of the determination and the strength and the power and the grit that the mare has. And so to me, that's the big question, or the thing that I'm seeking is how we can identify, you know, what little thing separates those horses and makes a winner, that makes a competitor. Whereas the Tommy Gunn horse is a wonderful horse. He's easy to train. He's a joy to be around. He just doesn't have the grit and that drive that always a shiny chick has. And so they're out of the same mother, yet they possess a lot of the same characteristics, but then there's some that are very different.
Okay, I'm going to see, you have her, I think, listed as available for offers, just playing around with it. I'm going to see if I can find her here under Find a Horse. If I describe her, genetics, let's see if she comes up. Let's see. I think you just have her listed as a reiner, correct?
Yes.
Let's see who comes up under that build. Well, there she is. And you can grab her here, and you can breed her against anyone, depending on what types of attributes you want your horse to have. I don't know what happens if we do a long distance animal, vigilant. Let's just see what happens if we click build that way. Oh, we find a whole bunch of options. Ooh, that would be an interesting. Maybe we shouldn't pit her against the show jumper, but I didn't specify a discipline, so there we go. All right.
Well, everybody stood somewhere.
We actually have a follow-up question to that as well. Sarah has asked, does the platform already have the genetic information for a lot of common sires in different disciplines? For example, if I want to find a good sire match to breed my mare to, can I just send in my mare's sample and explore the matches with different sires? Or would I have to send in samples of those sires as well?
So the Build a Horse platform is in beta, and we haven't released it to everyone yet. Just a few folks have it. But when people have access to Build a Horse, when they have an Etalon account and they've tested a horse and they have subscribed to Build a Horse, they can control their publicity. In other words, they can activate their horses or inactivate their horses as viewable to other people with Build a Horse accounts. So Jeff can choose whether or not I can see always a shiny chick and how much of her I can see. He can also choose whether or not he wants to reveal himself, his email, or his phone number. And if he doesn't want to reveal any of that information, he just wants to put a horse out there, say, to either be bred, to lease, to sell, or for his own information, he will have the option when he finds an animal he is interested in, if they have privatized their information, he can click send a message. And that way, the person who owns the horses who may not want to reveal their private information will receive a message from Jeff, and they can choose whether or not to respond to him. So you have as much control as you would like to have. No one is volunteered to reveal their information. It is purely up to the owner and what they want to unlock and not unlock. Does that make sense?
I think so. We've got another question from Kelly. She says, I'm seeing a lot of navicular and quarter horses lately, especially in the young ones, particularly her own 8-year-old who has a very limited ride time. Is there a marker for a predisposition for this?
I think without a doubt, that would be a Dr. Brooks question.
So navicular is right at the top of our wish list, right, Dr. Allen? That's one we are definitely going to go after very soon. There is some genetic component to that. Part of that is going to be related to hoof conformation. We have some reasonably good studies that show that variation in hoof conformation does change your risk for navicular syndrome. So we will carefully study hoof conformation phenotype in addition to the actual radiographic changes and types of clinical indicators we have of the disease. What we don't have yet are studies that document how much of that problem is going to be genetic. It's obviously complex in that there are some environmental components to it, but the trends like you mentioned, where you're seeing it more frequently in quarter horses, it is known to be more frequent in quarter horses and thoroughbreds. That's well documented, and that I think we're starting to see more of it does tend to suggest that it's going to have a fairly strong genetic component. So I'm going to guess it's moderately heritable. Now, what can you do with something that's moderately heritable? Well, you have a couple of options. You can try to make breeding decisions if you're a breeder to reduce that possibility. Probably not eliminate it. I have a feeling that, navicular is a syndrome. So I have a feeling that with bad shoeing and a terrible environment, you can make almost any horse have navicular problems. But you can hedge your bets and try to limit the amount that things like navicular will impact your breeding program. And then the other thing you can do is, if you do have a very, very young horse who is prone to navicular, well, you could look on a pre-purchase exam. First of all, that's something I would definitely do. But then you may use that to alter your management. So you may particularly guard that horse, already get him into an excellent shoeing program, and carefully manage his environment to minimize the risk as much as possible. You may put more economic investment into risk mitigation for that particularly susceptible horse than you would for the rest of your stable, because it may not be economically viable to do that. So I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna predict it's gonna be a moderately heritable trait, and we really, really want it. So we've got some research in the planning stages for sure, and as soon as we tick off one of our other hit list diseases, I think it is probably going to be next.
And on that same note, I think Dr. Allen probably has a wealth of information here about a disease that we're working on. This leads us down the road of what Etalon really does. We are a giant crowdsourced research project. And that hit list that Dr. Brooks is alluding to includes several diseases that we've been working on. And a couple of these things, we have papers submitted. And what that means is these are scientifically composed, written up studies that we're conducting or have conducted that are then peer reviewed by people who don't have any kind of conflict of interest. They're just scientists or equine geneticists or veterinarians who then review the work and validate it or invalidate it. Dr. Allen, would you like to do a little reveal?
Sure. Do you want to bring up some of the slides?
Sure. I've got a nice slide here for you.
We had a meeting with the veterinary advisors and Etalon and last December. And what we talked about were what diseases we thought we could go ahead and look at fairly quickly and try to determine whether or not they had a genetic component. And just as Dr. Brooks was talking about navicular, we think it probably does have a heritable component, but is going to have a lot of other factors that play into it. She was talking about earlier. But one of the things that we'd always thought should have a strong heritable factor, and one that could be looked at with genetic technology, is kissing spines. And kissing spines, you can see on the slide on your left, their space between those dorsal spinous processes. Those horses should have no trouble. You go to the slide on the right now, and you see that these dorsal spinous processes are impinging, and they have impinged to the point where they have cystic structures and arthritic, they're rubbing together. These horses, depending upon the job they do, will have performance limitations and may require a lot of treatment, and sometimes even with that treatment, they will not be a very a good performing horse. They'll have difficulties. So one of the things that we looked at was, okay, could we do that? And several of the people on the veterinary advisory board put in a lot of samples of x-rays and hair or blood So we could determine that. We were able to get a paper written. It was accepted and will be presented at the American Association of Equine Practitioners meeting here this December, which unfortunately is being virtual, but it will definitely be there. So we're very excited about that, and we think that we have other diseases targeted that we can determine that as well. But the kissing spines and associated arthritis with the back, those problems are there from an early age. They just don't express until later. So this gives you a chance to take hair or a blood sample and figure out, or maybe even the build-a-horse model, maybe even figure it out before you ever breed the mare. But certainly you're going to have the opportunity to figure it out early rather than late when the horse is 6 or 7 and bucking people off and having all kinds of difficulty, and you're showing up at the vet and asking what can be done.
No, thank you for that. We have a question specifically for Karen O'Connor. This is from Jackie. Have you used Etalon with any of your horses, and did that help make decisions on what to do or not to do with the horse?
Thanks for the question. I think that what Etalon has done for me is to be able to open up a whole new level of, open your mind up to be able to think that you could actually have information that's going to help you, create a amazing horse and been able to train it up to whatever level you want to. In the sport of eventing, we are breeding for 3 different sports. So we're triathletes, and we need a horse that has an amazing movement for the dressage. It has to have a very careful intuition about show jumping, where it doesn't want to touch the jumps. And then on the cross country, it's got to have enough thoroughbred blood, or the thoroughbred idea of cross country and galloping for a very long distance. It's really difficult to find that horse for high performance. I mean, at the very, very top. And yet, for event riders at the beginner level or the amateur level, we're looking for a horse that has to have a temperament that's really, really helping the rider learn how to do the sport. So we have a lot of things going on, and I would say, yes, we have tested a couple of the top level horses. Krista and a couple of other people were here a few weeks ago and took tests on Mr. Medicott and also Mandiva, both Olympic horses for me. And it would be interesting, Krista, I don't know if you want to.
Hold on, I think we lost her momentarily here. Krista, did you have the information she was alluding to?
Well, I'm not certain. So we did do the tests on the horses that she's talking about, and there were distinct differences between those horses. But one thing we don't do, and forgive me for saying this on a webinar, we never share confidential horse information without the owner's consent and without her talking about it. I will not, I will not go there. I will say that you can definitely tell the difference between temperaments, much more so than we would have ever thought. And it was an early study. If you'd like to go down that road, we can sort of talk about the ancestry and composition and how it works for eventers and for show jumpers and warm blood folks. But it sort of depends on where you'd like to go. So I want to leave the floor open for questions. But again, I apologize. I will not reveal what we found in her horses. She's happy about it, but I'm not at liberty to. I apologize.
No, I mean, on that note, we have another question that says, what genes are going to affect my horse in the performance arena?
I think I would leave that question to the geneticist, and with a second vote from, boy, this is a hard one. There are definitely 3 aspects here, and they're all about Jeff Petska and Kent Allen and Samantha Brooks. Guys?
Well, that's a really open question. If you say which genes are important, I'm a geneticist, so I'm going to say all of them. all of them are important. But I think what the question is looking for is what kinds of things do we have that are immediately applicable to the performance horse? Because performance is many, many different factors and a lot of environment and training too. Genetics, they can't do it all, of course. So one of the things that we've done that could be of interest to the performance horse owner, breeder, and trainer that is a little bit more general is we've started looking at ancestry and the genetic level of match between two horses. So Karen mentioned that she had tested, say, Mr. Medicott, and you know, he's not a breeding animal, but what could we do to try to find a horse that would be similar to him in his level of talent and his temperament and things like that? Well, you know, it'll take many years to develop all the genetic markers that we might want to do that. But what we can do right away is look among his relatives and the horses in the Build a Horse database and find a horse who is most closely genetically similar across the board to Mr. Medicott. So you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to clone a horse like that, or you can go straight into the database partnering with Etalon and try to find a horse who's, say, already living or some breeding stock or horses for sale that closely matches his genetic profile, not in the specifics, but across the board in generality. We tend to do this already as horse people. You know, if we have a mare that we like, we go and see if we can find something that has similar breeding to her. But pedigrees are really pretty superficial. And as anyone who's ever had a sibling rivalry will know, thank goodness, identical pedigrees do not mean identical personalities or level of performance. So this genetic match option is really great go-to, particularly when you're doing horse selection or you want to go and purchase a horse. And then the other thing it can do, so Karen mentioned this idea that you need to have the right amount of thoroughbred blood to get around a cross-country course, and that's absolutely true, right? But for another discipline, you might want a slightly different mix. So Krista, I don't know if you can show our discipline slide there. So what we've done is examine the ancestry of some top-level FEI horses using their genetic profile. So thousands of markers, not their pedigree, not 20 markers, not just a few, but many, many markers. And when we take that ancestry and we look, say, about a few hundred to a few thousand years ago, we get into these breed groups that we call type. And horse people, we're familiar with type, right? You have a heavy horse type, you have the pony type, you have a thoroughbred, a light horse type, the Arabians, the Oriental breeds, things like that. So many of our modern performance horses, you know, they're all warm bloods, one way or another, but they have a slightly different mix of those same components. So if you look on the far left, you can see our population of international level show jumpers has about 50% thoroughbred ancestry. That's the navy blue. And then, you know, a portion of European heavy horse, that gives them some durability. A portion of some carriage type horses, that gives them a free shoulder and a lovely well-set neck. And they have on average 7% of that Oriental Arabian for some spirit and just a little touch of some Iberian blood in there as well. Compare that to the eventer, who's in the center. Now these horses, they are a little bit different, right? Most horse people can look at them and say they're different, but what's on the inside is a little bit more thoroughbred and light horse blood. So that helps them pick up that speed cross country. So if I'm out looking to buy a Trakehner, if I'm going to want to event with it, I'm probably going to pass up the one that might only have 50% thoroughbred by ancestry and instead look at the one that has more than closer to 2/3. And it's important to note that these numbers do not always agree with the pedigree because the pedigree is just an estimate. And finally, if we look at those reiners, we saw some beautiful reiners just a moment ago. They have same components, but a slightly different mix and a slightly different type. A little less thoroughbred, a little bit more balance coming from the carriage horse, and a little bit more spirit maybe from that Near Eastern Oriental type horse, and definitely a little more Spanish and Iberian influence, because we know many of those horses had their ancestry back to colonial North America, where we had lots of Spanish influence. So this is, you know, we're a long way away from being able to tell you all the markers for performance, but immediately, based on tools that are well published, that are well documented and peer reviewed, we can start to give you a little more information to help you make a better educated choice as a horse buyer or trainer.
We also have several questions on genetics and behavior. For example, is spookiness related to DNA at all, or courage or bravery? How can you identify these components in the genes?
Well, I like to tell my students that I would have to argue that temperament is the #1 economic trait in the horse. We will, as Dr. Allen can probably tell us, we will spend a lot of money trying to keep a kind and a courageous horse sound versus one that tries to kill us every time we go to ride it. So temperament is huge, and it is very complex, but there are some very, very basic reflexes that I think are particularly relevant to horses and horse training. And in my research program here at the university, we are focusing a large part of our effort on better understanding the startle reflex in the horse. So we've all experienced this. Somebody walks up behind you and gooses you in the ribs, you startle. And some people will jump more severely than others. Some horses will jump more severely than others. And that first initial startle response, that is subconscious. And in lots of our model species, mice in particular, but also in humans, there's a fairly small number of genes that can really influence that initial subconscious neural circuitry fired startle response. So we're starting there in the horse because, well, we think it's going to be a fairly easy target. What we've learned so far, and that one of my graduate students presented at a conference last January, is that the difference between a horse who, as a 2-year-old, has maintained some of that difference in startle response versus those who maybe haven't settled down as much is about 2/3 due to genetics. About 1/3 remaining in the environment. So if they're going to be that initial fear, if they're going to experience or not, is about 2/3 genetic. Now, in the same experiments, we measured what happens after they experience that first initial reflexive spook. And what we found is that that's largely environmental. So this is where guys like Jeff are going to be able to really try to work with that particular horse and help to modulate that particular fear response. So we definitely have horses who just have that very hair trigger, like they can be set off very quickly. And that can be largely genetic, but then what they do with that fear, that's going to be more training and environment. That means, though, that if you want a 4-H horse to go and just pack a couple of kids around, you could go and shop for a horse maybe that doesn't, as a young horse, certainly doesn't have so many of those fear response or startle response alleles. But if you want an excellent show jumper or maybe a barrel horse, you might be just fine with those fear alleles as long as you can harness them. He's going to have quick reflexes, but you carefully train that horse to manage that fear, get him confident in his trainer, confident in his rider, so that he can use that to his advantage in his particular discipline. So yes, there are definitely some genes involved in temperament, but a lot of environment as well.
What about for other?
Sam.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Dr. Allen.
Well, I was just going to agree with her is that, you know, in the pre-purchase exam, #1 problem I see is still lameness. But the #2 problem is attitude. And so anything that gives you a better handle on that is worth its weight in gold, because that's not something, unfortunately, the veterinarian is well equipped to deal with.
If I might just jump in for a second, apparently Mr. Medicott's owner is watching us and sent us a message saying we could talk about that horse, which is pretty fortuitous, and I'll keep it short and sweet. I will say that Mr. Medicott was one of 2 horses that we recently tested with Karen. And interestingly enough, they were different in 2 key regions. Of course, both of these horses made it all the way to the top. And so their genetic results, as expected, were fairly what I like to call boring. There wasn't a lot on there because they made it. You won't find a lot of issues. They didn't have warm blood fragile foal syndrome, which actually shouldn't affect their performance that we know of, but they didn't have PSSM and they didn't have any of these other afflictions. But what they did have was 2 completely different temperament testings, 2 different alleles there. And they definitely train differently. And what they also had, Mr. Medicott likes to try to get fat. And when he tries to get fat, he tries to get laminitis. And that is a major issue if you don't manage it properly. As Dr. Allen will tell you, it's better to stop the problem ahead of time, not let everybody out on the back 40 in Kentucky in the spring to eat to their heart's delight. Because the consequence will be 800 pounds in laminitis. So you have to manage these conditions before they happen, because as much as we all like to see Dr. Allen, we don't like to see him when it's because we have laminitis.
Kind of on that note, specifically with laminitis, are you able to test post-mortem on horses that may have died from laminitis, or to find some kind of marker?
Well, we have a number of studies underway examining laminitis, and actually a fair number published. In comparison to navicular, there's far more studies already published from my group as well as others that have provided us with a few genetic markers that will contribute to laminitis. Of course, laminitis is an itis. It's an inflammation there of the laminae in the hoof, and there are a number of different ways that can be triggered. But some of the more heritable, or those that have a larger genetic component, are the ones related to obesity and metabolic efficiency, and how that horse handles what it is that they are eating. And so in my research program, we really have focused on those particular types of markers. So if you had a horse who passed away from laminitis, yes, we can get DNA from lots of sources. Actually, the oldest whole genome sequence done so far in science was of an ancient horse that might have been around 700,000 years old. So we've got some good geneticists looking at the horse that can really get some fantastic information from old DNA samples. So I'll say there's lots that's possible there. As important as laminitis is, our real challenge right now is in getting all the resources pulled together to do some more expansive studies. But I have a couple of markers published from some work that actually started in the Arabian horse. We know Arabians are tough and can be very hardy, and they have a slightly higher than average risk for laminitis. So we went after some of those markers first. What we've discovered is that they are shared with a number of breeds. So we'll be looking more closely to see how much risk that same marker might confer on a slightly different genetic background. It's going to have a slightly different mix. And then we very recently published another marker that was associated with some biochemical markers of metabolic syndrome and laminitis. And that one in particular was related to some obvious obesity genes that are well documented both in people and in mice. So, these are horses that 50 years ago would have been hugely valuable because your feed bill would have been a whole lot lower. But these days it can become a liability because we try to give them optimal nutrition. Our nutritionist collaborators have done a fantastic job in figuring out a lot about how to better feed a horse, so much so that we feed them too well in a lot of occasions. So these are great markers to have in your pocket because if you have a young horse, you can identify that, yes, he has a higher risk at these particular loci, and I might lean towards keeping him at that 5 of a body condition score rather than the 7 or 8 that a lot of our particularly our quarter horses and dressage horses will go out and compete at that 7 or 8 body condition score quite successfully. But if I want to manage laminitis risk, I might try to bring that body condition score down preemptively.
Oh, thank you. We have a few questions about the results from the Etalon test. So has Etalon been used by buyers during the pre-purchase exam? And are these results kind of able to be read by the owner, or are they more veterinary style reports?
We try to make the reports, they're an ever-changing process. We're trying to get away from the tech talk and the alphabet soup that people don't understand. It doesn't make sense. What we always do is change according to what our clients and veterinarians and competitors tell us. I think that there are some portions on these results that would appeal to Dr. Allen, and he would talk with us about those. And there are certainly some that appeal to Jeff and Karen. And if Jeff and Karen come back to us and say, hey, what does this mean? And we talk about it and it means something to them, but we didn't say it the way they understood it, we go back and change it. So it's an ever evolving process. I think the best way to ask Jeff, how did you feel about the raw results when I gave them back to you without any explanation? Were most of them clear? Were some of them clear? What did you think?
Well, it took me a little bit to, understand the process, but, and after visiting with you, I think if I received the report without having spoken with you and you kind of walking me through a little bit about what they meant, it wouldn't have been very valuable to me. But once you started to lead me through that, and then I started to get familiar with the site and how to use it, then it becomes quite easy, because when you, just like with the variants, when you scroll across them, then an explanation will come up telling you a little more information about them, and then it's up to me, from the behavioral standpoint or the performance standpoint. That's the parts of this that are really fascinating to me, is how do I marry different training techniques and methods and approaches to different variants, and how my horse is going to respond to those.
And I think that's the key. It's to work with the people who know the horses and to shape the answers in a way that they're understandable and really usable. And while most of us here, we're obviously hardcore scientists and veterinarians, we're also horse people. So we get it, but we don't know everything, and we certainly aren't going to see it the way everybody else sees it. And it's going to vary by person to person and discipline to discipline and breed to breed. So it's an ever-changing process, and we love your input. That I can promise you. If you have feedback and you have things that you need to understand and we didn't do it right, you need to say so.
I love that. A couple more questions, and then I might need to cut us off here at 8:30, but I love all these questions. They just keep coming. From Karen, I thought this was very interesting. Is it worthwhile to test the DNA of a horse that is older, such as one that is over 20 years old?
So can you hear me all right?
Karen's back.
I'm back. I'm sorry about the technology. I think that it is actually as valuable as a young horse. I think that the older generation that has performed has already got a record of performance. That's the data we're looking for, in fact, because we all need to breed the next generation. And if you have a horse that's been very successful, we talked about just before I got cut off, we talked about the follicles that we've done for Mandiba and Mr. Medicott. They're retired. They are retired, totally retired, as everybody saw out in the field here in Virginia, having great retirement. But what is inside their body that we can benefit from before they've had end of life, we can discover so many things from that amount of experience and success. It doesn't have to be Olympic horses. My goodness, there's success at every single level of horse. Every rider wants to find the unicorn, And, you know, if we could breed a unicorn and know that it's that before, you know, through DNA, just before it's born, I mean, can you imagine? It's extraordinary. So the answer to that is yes, we actually want to get all the older horses. We want to know why they were successful and impart the DNA. We also have to examine somehow to be able to put markers on what's the intangible. It's always the mystery. The intangible is totally the mystery of why does a horse want to be a champion? Is it conformation? Is it DNA? Is it jumping ability for me? Is it riding ability? What makes a champion? In many cases, it's very intangible. The fight for right, the fight to be competitive. They demonstrate that for professionals every single day, and through experience, all professionals have, you know, sort of their own database on what it takes to be a really top horse. But the DNA gives us the ability to understand through breeding what are the chances, what are, you know, everything's a risk. There's huge risk when you breed, huge. It doesn't always come, most of the time it doesn't come out the way you wanted it to, but through DNA testing, I think that we're getting closer to being able to satisfy the breeder.
Thank you for that, Karen. We had several questions about the test itself, ranging quite a bit between how many genes does it test, what system do you use, the cost, and the turnaround time. So I thought we could address that for a little bit.
Oh dear, let's see. I'm going to try to give as brief and informative of answers as I possibly can. So in layman's terms, the way we do DNA testing is a little bit backwards from what most people have been doing. We focus on a technique called sequencing. And what that means is you pull the DNA from the animal and you run the DNA without any bias, and then you look at the genome and see what's in it. I hope I'm explaining this correctly. But what that means is if a horse in front of you is red and you test for the known gene of red, it will come back positive, right? In the traditional sense, using what I like to call the O.J. Simpson methodology, which is a traditional primer, and you throw the DNA in a dish, and if it has that particular sequence, it will stick and you'll get a yes or no answer, right? With a gel or signal. But in sequencing, you can get answers you didn't expect or unknown answers. For instance, the horse in front of you is red and you use a traditional test for red and it comes back negative, but you know that the horse is red. You're looking at it and it's red. So maybe it's not the red that is known, maybe it's a new kind of red. And in looking at the DNA in sort of an unbiased way, looking at the genetic sequences, you can begin to see some of the things that you've never seen before by not assuming anything. And proof of that is visible in publications that we put out and others have put out. You can see new whites that we found. You can see new dilutions. Those are the easier things to find. Harder things to find are things like kissing spines, because if you're going to do DNA sequencing for kissing spines, you can't just use a bunch of samples where people say, oh, my horse has kissing spines. You need somebody like Ken Allen to say, yes, it has kissing spines. Here's the proof. I've diagnosed it. Otherwise, you're just sort of chasing your tail. So we do use a mix of technologies, but that's the primary focus because we're looking at discovery. Did that answer that question okay?
I think so. What about the nitty-gritty stuff? Like how much does it cost and what's the turnaround time?
So the point of this was never for us to make $1 billion. That would be great, but that's not the point. The point of this is to make it affordable. So A, everyone can use it, and B, there's a little bit of time and money built into it so we can use the extra money to discover new things to continue to build a bigger and bigger platform. So our flagship product, the first thing that we made that we started in 2013 and it took us a couple of years to figure out how to do it, is $99. And I think there are 55 to 60 total tests on that. So if you think about it, it's less than $2 a variant, which is pretty much the most reasonable rate you're going to see anywhere. But the point was not not to make a bargain basement thing. The point was to take the DNA, to run it on all these different things in an unbiased way and create a picture of an animal. Our intent was never to go out and sell tests. I want to test for black, I want to test for fast, I want to test for tall. Instead, I want to test for everything and take a look at the whole horse, because I want to win. And win may mean, you know, make it down the course and dominate the Olympics, but win may also mean I can ride my horse all day long and jump 2 feet and not get hurt. He won't run away. He won't get PSSM. He won't get laminitis. These kinds of things that everyday riders face and have to deal with. So our flagship thing is pretty affordable by any other standard. And we have additional products for fun things. We have things like Ancestry for, you know, a bigger view and composition view. And ultimately, the goal here is to form a perfect round picture. We also have genetic identification and we have parentage, but the parentage is built in a way that if everyone begins to use it, pretty soon, if you go to a kill pen and buy an unknown horse and just send us a sample, we'll be able to tell you, here are the parents, here are the siblings, go back, register, have a good life. It's a much larger picture, I think, than most people understand. But it's what we wanted.
Yeah, you're making a roadmap. It's amazing.
Yeah, so Nicole, I'll just add that one of the biggest differences here is that we're using some of the fastest, most current technology. It includes genome-wide panels of thousands of markers. This is that scale of approach, which is radically different than what the industry standard has been for the last 2 decades. So that's where we really start to, you know, a lot of the markers that we offer have been known for literally decades, but weren't able to be used by horse owners because they hadn't yet been picked up by the industry, or they weren't very translatable. It was difficult to explain to horse owners, and we didn't have a platform to be able to communicate that information. So I think the point here was to take things to the next level, use modern technologies for doing the genetic side, and then get the help from the horse owners in learning how to communicate the information that they needed to them, and to bring them into future studies so we could examine the types of traits that are most useful and interesting to them.
And I would actually add to that as well, that when you have platforms that are already giving the amount of thoroughbred blood that there is in a horse, we do the genetic testing that your state-of-the-art testing is, and the thoroughbred blood percentage can be very, very different than what is given to you on the websites that proclaim to have, you know, the answer.
I have a slide. You want to see it?
Sure.
This is Karen's favorite slide. I'll pull this one up. These are comparisons of percent blood for our eventers out there. They're reported versus actual. Dr. Brooks, you want to elaborate on that with Karen?
Sure. So these horses were kindly provided to us as an example of how different the actual ancestry of the horse can be than what is predicted in their pedigree, as Karen was just telling us. So Windfall, fantastic competitor, right? Fabulous stallion. If you look at his pedigree, you might have concluded that he could have been a little bit light for eventing. But when we look at what his DNA says, so the pedigree gave us about 84% thoroughbred blood, but when we look at his actual DNA level ancestry, he was right at that sweet spot of 65%, of course, making him a fantastic inventing competitor. And then we also considered 2 of his sons, Van Diver and Setzerleg. And of course, Setzerleg's really in particular making his mark on eventing now. Van Diver, the pedigree wasn't as far off, about 3%, but with Setzerleg, the pedigree predicted him to be too heavy. We might have sent him to go be a show jumper, and maybe he'd be fantastic at that too, but pedigree predicted him at about 42% thoroughbred ancestry. But again, when we looked at the DNA level, His DNA said he was 63% thoroughbred, in fact. So those pedigree estimates, they can really drift from generation to generation, and they're only as good as the information in the pedigree. So even in our continental warm bloods that have deep, deep books, they often go back to animals that had themselves unknown ancestry. So you miss some of that thoroughbred blood that's been there since the very, very beginning.
And I also, it would be interesting for you to have your thoughts on cruising, because that is a very, very special stallion that has produced so many offspring that have gone to the top. And when you look at him, he's a overstuffed Connemara pony. He is a big, beautiful, but he has the look of a pony. And yet, you know, I've ridden many, many cruisings, and they can go all day long. They have enough stamina to, you know, for all of us. And you look at that chart, and it's very, very different from what is, you know, his pedigree is published and what actually the DNA says.
Yeah, absolutely. He is one of my favorite examples, because as you say, you look at him and you would say, you know, he's not going to have the speed. And our really skilled old time horsemen, you know, they'll say, feel their hair, you know, look at the thickness of their tail. Do they have feathers on their legs? In looking for warm bloods or sport horses that are going to be too heavy. And when all you have is what's on the surface, sure, that's great advice, but we have more than that now. And when you look at his DNA and let him speak for himself, you can see he was at what, just about 60% there, Krista?
Yeah.
He's got a lot more staying power coming from that thoroughbred than you see on the cover of that book. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't ask the DNA. It's just not apparent in the pedigree.
And it's funny because I can tell you firsthand that you ride a cruising and you're shocked at their staying power. You know, it's just, it doesn't add up to the pedigree or, you know, but it is the DNA. So where is the connection from the pedigree to that intangible part of the horse that makes them want to be a champion? And
that is what we're building.
That's the tough question.
That's right.
And on that note, somebody asked, how can people get more involved in genetic research?
Tell us what you know. Nobody knows your horse better than you do. That's what we all think's been missing, right? If you ask me a question, I'm going to give you a different answer than Dr. Brooks will give you, than Dr. Allen will give you, than Jeff or Karen, right? We're all different types of horse people. But what we have in common is when we spend our life savings and everything we have on these animals, even if we can't afford lunch or new tennis shoes, we don't care. We have to spend money on the horses. We have to spend time with the horses. That time spent in the stable, breeding animals, riding them, all of that gives you skills that you don't know that you have. And the observations that these people have on their animals is invaluable. When you send in DNA and we give you back your results and we ask you questions about it and we give you surveys and we want to talk to you, we sincerely mean we want to talk to you. And the information is used. And we do develop new things all the time. Ultimately, the question might be, well, where's the business prowess in this? You want world domination for horse, genetics. The secret here is that horses are a lovely, lovely mammalian model of genetics. And in discovering things in horses, without keeping animals in a laboratory, we discover things for human use. That's the value of this platform. This is for discovery across species, helping horses, helping humans. And we can really only do it and accelerate it together. So that's the real mission. I want to win.
I think also, Krista, that how do you get more involved? Get that follicle to Etalon, and because your power is in your database, and it's about growing a database. We have to get more horses, worldwide that are in the database, so we have more knowledge about the specifics of how to build a horse. You can't build a horse off of 50 horses. You got to build a horse off of 5 million horses. So yes, that is the best way to get more involved, is get that follicle to the Etalon scientists. Absolutely.
And not just the top horse. As Karen's saying, when we work together, I don't just ask her for her, you know, gold medal winners. I want the brother that didn't make it.
Yeah.
Why didn't he make it?
Yeah, and that's really, really an interesting side of it. You know, like in the case of Mandiva, his full brother also went to the Olympic Games. It was Zara Phillips. And, you know, it's like, how did two full brothers make it to Olympic Games? That's really extraordinary. But there's another brother that really didn't care. He didn't have that work ethic. He didn't have that fight for, you know, supremacy in the sport, you know. So what happened to him? And, you know, it's really interesting that you can actually calculate it through the markers that you guys have been talking about this evening. It's an amazing group of crazy, crazy scientists that also love horses. So it's an awesome experience for me.
This is going to be our last question of the night. I will say we'll have to plan a round 2 for this because the questions just keep coming in. So Krista, you and I will have to chat. For this last question, it's when will the infamous Build-A-Horse be available?
Oh, we've been so outed. So we were originally going to release this for January breeding season as, you know, this big, huge thing, but then COVID hit. And I meant by January, I meant January 2021. And then COVID hit and we were all sitting around depressed. Oh, what are we going to do? We started to notice something funny. People were sitting at home with their horses and they started sending in samples and asking questions and getting really, you know, into their horses again. And we thought, all right, so we started to release it in beta phase a little bit early because let's give people something to do and think about. Let's shape it the way we want to see it shaped. So we're at a stage now where it's still in beta phase, but it's in late beta phase. And we're going to begin to release it at the end of September. We will probably release it to a limited number of folks, probably by request, probably to Etalon clients that we know or people that are testing their animals that we've worked with before. And as we get more towards November, we'll work on the full release. But the features will keep coming probably for a good, I'd say 6 months to a year and a half. We have huge plans for Build-A-Horse. It's already pretty big, has a lot of fun things people can do, from breeding each other's horses and getting predictions to sharing the horses, selling them and putting them out for stallion at stud or lease. But the features we want to focus on, they're going to be a lot bigger than people can imagine. They're going to be a lot of fun. But as Karen is saying, if we can't translate the technology, it's not going to matter what we put out there. So as we release this, we truly want feedback. We truly want people to say, I get this, but what the heck does that mean? Or why didn't you put a button here? Because that's the only way we're going to build this the way you want it. So we're releasing it in phases starting at the end of September. Is that a good answer?
I think it leaves them with just enough, a little bit more, you know. But again, this is fabulous and it's an amazing opportunity. You don't get very many companies who are looking for feedback and honestly want to put it into their work. So it's fabulous that you're looking for that. I just want to thank all of our panelists for tonight. This has been incredibly educational. Etalon Diagnostics, you've put together just, it's out of the park. It's amazing. So thank you for working with Equitana USA, and we're very excited to have you guys next year and in the coming months. I mean, our virtual opportunities keep expanding and we'd love to have more of these. Again, the questions are still coming in.
That's great. That's awesome.
No, thank you all. And this recording, this presentation is being recorded. It will be posted on the Equitana USA platforms. It will also be sent to Etalon, and I'm sure they'll be sending it out as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I added my email in the chat, but it's nNicoleForbes@readexpo.com. And otherwise, we'll touch base soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us and for everybody for joining, really.
Thank you, Krista.